This is Adam from the Shimmering Carnelians, and I wanted to go over how I set up my folder routing in Reaper to make sure that in the end the single tracks are routed to reverb and delay and the mix bus appropriately, but also to make sure that I'm working efficiently and in the end the compression is not damaged by inappropriate volume routing. And if that doesn't make sense to you, hopefully by the end of this brief training, it will. This is more of an overview. I'm going to touch on some things that I think are important, but I'm not going to go into tutorial mode and show every little thing I do to set it up. There are plenty of tutorials out there from Kenny Joya, and there's also a forum called the Cocos. I'm not sure how to say that, but it's a Reaper forum where many of these types of questions get answered. Okay, and that's what makes Reaper such a great program. So these are my tracks. And what I've done is I've taken two individual tracks you can see left and right, and I've put them in a folder. And why this is important is these are going to be played simultaneously. These are roughly the same. They're a doubled track, so they're playing the same part, which makes them sound bigger. And they're also going to be panned hard left and hard right. And what happens when it goes to the folder is it sums the volume of both of the tracks. So when that happens, it can affect the compressor. So after I've made my recordings, I take the doubled tracks and put them inside of a folder. That helps me to organize them. And by clicking this button, I can open and close the folder to make the workflow easier. And again, the tutorial on how to do that, it will be easy to find. So something that's very important is to get the volume set properly before adding any other plugins. So in order to do that, I test the sound. So here we can do this here. Okay, so inside the folder on the tracks, you can see the volume levels for each of these. And right now for me, they're up too high. So what I usually do, and everyone does this a bit differently, but I look for the 50 to 75% of the fader bar, and that's what I shoot for. So for me, that's negative 18 decibels. Some people contend that. People do it differently. I encourage you to do some research and use what you believe is the best volume setting for you. But in the end, whichever number you choose, make sure you hit that number here before adding any other plugins. And I do recommend using Reaper's volume adjustment. It's very simple, it's easy to use, and what it does is it sets the track up to receive incoming plugins. Okay, so the track, once it's recorded and you're about to add plugins, there's an optimal level you can set it to receive the incoming plugins for the best results. So now that we have our volume set up, we're ready to start bringing in other plugins. And this is where things can get tricky. And this is the reason I wanted to do this brief tutorial. Okay. So I'm going to start by working on the EQ. So with EQ, you can have both of the doubled tracks running into the folder And this is especially important if you're working with guitars with different tonalities. You can blend them using a single EQ knob. So that's what we're going to do. So this is the SSL channel strip, and it does a number of different things, but right now I'm working on the EQ. Okay, so as you can see, I've gone through and set up the EQ how I want it. Okay, and how to sweep and do EQ is a different program that you can find information on fairly easily. But what's important to note, number one, you can see that for this particular plugin, it's in the mono setting. Okay, so it's probably a bit confusing because I already mentioned that I'm going to pan these tracks hard left and hard right. So if you'll just hang in there with me, you'll see why we're doing this. Okay. So essentially right now, because I haven't gone through and actually done the panning, both of these tracks are being summed to center, which means that they're being blended together. So if I go through and do the EQ now, it will be being applied to both of these tracks. Okay. And then once I'm finished, I can go ahead and drop them on the individual tracks. And again, this is where things can get confusing and what caused me a lot of backtracking, and it just slowed down my process having to learn this the hard way. So this is why I'm sharing this with you now. The EQ is pretty benign. In theory, I could just leave it on the bus because it's going to be applied to both of the tracks anyway. And by bus, I mean the folder that houses the doubled tracks. Okay. But the problem comes later when you're using compression and when you're trying to route the tracks for delay and reverb. So essentially, for some plugins that don't require the volume to be the same, like EQ, you can put it on the main folder. But for anything where the volume of the track is going to impact the outcome of the plugin, like a compressor or anything that involves compression, you're going to need to work on it on the single track. Okay, and I'll show you what that means. So we've got, as you can see here, I moved the folder plugin to the single tracks. And what we're about to do is see what happens with the compressor. Okay, so actually, let's bring this back up here. We'll start with that. Let's get out of here, mono. Here we go. Okay. So right now I've got this set on 2, but remember what's happening. Both tracks are being routed to the same plugin. So it's going to be much louder because both tracks are playing at the same time. So let's see right here in this area how much input is coming in. Okay. Now let's contrast that with a single track. Okay, so this is one of the main reasons why I have these set up this way for the individual tracks to essentially be dictating to the plugins what happens. You could see here that the input from the single track was much less than when it was being applied to both tracks at the same time. And what that means is if I were to leave it on the bus folder and both tracks are being routed in at that higher volume level, in the end, the plugin would sound different being applied to each of the tracks from the main bus folder. So when it's going to each one, it would sound different in the mix after I moved the doubled tracks to hard left and hard right. It would hit the compressor differently when they were summed than if it was applied on the individual tracks. Okay, so what that means is because the doubled tracks were being summed and being louder, the result that I would be hearing when I'm setting up the compressor would change in the mix, and it wouldn't be hitting the individual tracks the way I wanted. It wouldn't give an accurate depiction of the individual tracks. So once I moved it to the individual tracks, what I can then do is determine the level of compression that I want to hit the plugin, and I can adjust the plugin. And then what I can do, and I already did it here, but I'll just for visual, we can see it. I started here on the single track, and then all I have to do, since I'm only dealing with compression now, is drag it over to the other track. Okay, so in that way, the compressor is hitting both of these in an accurate, real-time manner to produce an accurate result. Okay, so rather than slap the plugin on the folder, I added it to the individual tracks. And not only is the sound going to be accurate here, but the routing for what I'm about to do is going to be accurate as well. So that's how and why I set up the doubled tracks to go to the folder.